Welcome to the lost pages of history. For centuries, the canyons of the American Southwest held a civilization in perfect balance. The ancestral Puebloans, master architects, skilled farmers, and stargazers who built cities of stone that reached for the heavens. We see the ruins of Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde and imagine a peaceful people living in harmony with the earth, a society that simply vanished when the rains stopped coming. This is the story we are told, but it is a lie. The official narrative speaks of a great drought, of resource depletion, of a slow and tragic migration away from their ancestral homes. It's a clean, simple explanation for a silent, empty world, but the stones themselves tell a different story, a darker story. They whisper of a cataclysm not of nature, but of ambition. They speak of a war not against outsiders, but against their own. What if the enemy wasn't drought, but dogma? What if the force that shattered this civilization wasn't a change in the weather, but a change in leadership led by a single powerful woman? Prepare yourself because the shocking truth we've uncovered suggests the ancestral Puebloan society did not fade away. It was torn apart from the inside in a brutal civil war sparked by a great betrayal. This is the story of Malin, a name erased from the oral traditions, a priestess whose ambition set the canyons ablaze. She was said to possess a charisma that could sway the most steadfast warrior and a vision for her people that broke from centuries of tradition. The elders saw her as a dangerous radical, a heretic who questioned the sacred order. But many of the young and the disaffected saw her as a savior, a leader who would usher in a new age of power and prosperity. Malin preached that the old ways were too rigid, that their rituals were failing them. She pointed to the shifting climate not as a test of faith, but as a sign that the gods themselves demanded change. She proposed new ceremonies, new alliances, a new social order where her clan, and she as its head, would hold ultimate authority. This was more than a political maneuver. It was a spiritual coup. The great houses, once centers of commerce and ceremony, became fortresses. The plazas, once filled with the sounds of celebration, echoed with the cries of battle. Archaeological evidence we've long misinterpreted points to this conflict: burned kivas, unburied bodies found in ceremonial chambers, defensive walls erected hastily within the great cities. These are not signs of a peaceful migration. They are the scars of a civil war. Malin's followers, fueled by her promises, fought with a terrifying zeal. They saw themselves as righteous crusaders, purging their society of a weak and ineffective leadership. The traditionalists, the keepers of the old ways, fought to protect the very soul of their people. Brother turned against brother, clan against clan. The intricate network of roads that once connected their civilization now served as pathways for war parties. The betrayal was absolute. Malin, in her quest for power, is said to have committed the ultimate sin. She used sacred knowledge not for the benefit of the people, but for her own gain, twisting rituals to consolidate her rule and demonize her opponents. The trust that held Puebloan society together for 1,000 years was shattered in a single generation. In the end, there were no winners. The society was broken, the land stained with the blood of its own people. The survivors, horrified by the devastation, made a pact: they would abandon the great cities, the monuments to their pride and their downfall. They would scatter, taking with them a fractured memory of what had happened. And they would never again speak the name of the woman who had led them into ruin. They would erase Malin from history. So when you look upon the silent cities of the ancestral Puebloans, don't just see a people defeated by the climate, see a civilization that committed suicide. The shocking truth is not that they vanished. It's that they were forced to flee the memory of a war so terrible it had to be forgotten, a war started by one woman's ambition, a great betrayal that echoes in the canyons to this day. The schism had become a chasm. The whispers of dissent, fanned by Malin's charisma, had erupted into the roaring flames of war. The ancestral Puebloan world, once a delicate web of trade and ceremony, was now a chessboard for a conflict that would determine its very soul. This was not a war of conquest, but a war of ideas, fought with obsidian-tipped arrows and stone axes in the heart of a civilization. Malin's strategy was as radical as her theology. She was a master of psychological warfare. Her followers, calling themselves the Sun Chosen, moved with the fervor of true believers. They didn't just seek to defeat the traditionalist clans. They sought to erase their legitimacy. Malin directed them to seize control of the turquoise and macaw feather trade routes, cutting off the supply of materials essential for the old ceremonies. This was a brilliant and sacrilegious move, starving her enemies of their spiritual power. Her warriors would descend on smaller outlying villages, not always to kill, but to perform her new potent rituals, claiming the conversions as proof that the gods favored her. The traditionalists, a confederation of elder-led clans, were caught off guard. Their strength was in defense and tradition, not in rapid, offensive warfare. They controlled the great fortified cities, the great houses like Pueblo Bonito and Chetroquetl. Their strategy was to wait to hold their sacred ground, believing that Malin's heresy would eventually burn itself out and that the people would return to the true path. They underestimated her ambition and the desperation of those she had swayed. The first major battle was the siege of Sunstone House, a key northern citadel loyal to the old ways. For weeks the traditionalists held the high ground, their walls unbreachable. But Malin did not order a direct assault. Instead, she diverted a critical irrigation channel miles upstream, slowly strangling the city's water supply. As thirst and doubt began to weaken the defenders, her sun-chosen warriors used the cover of a moonless night to scale the canyon walls, not the city walls, bypassing the main defenses entirely. The fall of Sunstone House was a brutal shock. It was a message. No place was safe, and Malin would break any rule to win, but the traditionalists learned they were masters of the land. Their chance for revenge came at the Battle of Whispering Pass, a narrow, winding canyon that was the main artery for Malin's forces moving south. The elders laid a trap. They used runners to spread false information, luring a large contingent of Sun chosen into the pass with rumors of a lightly defended food store. As Malin's warriors entered the canyon, they were met with a terrifying avalanche, not of snow, but of rock and timber, set loose from the cliffs above. The ambush was devastating. It was a brutal reminder that knowledge of the land was a weapon as powerful as any army. The war escalated. What began as strategic skirmishes devolved into bitter personal vendettas. The evidence is carved into the ruins. We find villages burned to the ground, not for resources, but out of pure spite. Skeletons are found not in burial sites, but thrown into kivas, a profound act of desecration. The intricate road system, a marvel of engineering that once unified the people, now became a network of fear pathways for raiding parties and fleeing refugees. The climax of the war was not a battle for a city, but for the heart of their faith. Malin, in her boldest move, marched her army to the heart of Chaco Canyon itself. Her goal, to seize control of the Fayada Butte, the sacred sun dagger, the center of the Puebloan celestial calendar. To control the sun dagger was to control time prophecy and the divine mandate to rule. The traditionalists knew this could not be allowed. They gathered their remaining forces for a final desperate defense. The battle raged for days at the foot of the butte. It was a meat grinder, a conflict that consumed the last of the great warriors from both sides. Malin's son chosen, fighting with the belief that victory would grant them immortality, were relentless. The traditionalists, fighting for the memory of 1,000 years of their ancestors, were unbreakable. In the end, Malin's forces, through sheer numbers and fanatical zeal, broke the traditionalist lines and fought their way to the sacred site, but the victory was hollow. The fighting had been so brutal, the losses so catastrophic on both sides, that the civilization was left mortally wounded. The fields were fallow, the irrigation channels were destroyed, and the leadership of both factions was decimated. They had won the battle, but in doing so had lost their world. The great betrayal was complete, not just by Malin, but by all who had let their world burn in the name of being right. The dust settled over Fayada Butte. The cries of battle faded, replaced by an unnerving silence. Malin's son chosen had won the sacred ground, but the cost was a civilization. The traditionalist forces were broken, but the victors were no better off. They stood on a mountain of their own dead, inheritors of a kingdom of ash. The great cities, once vibrant centers of life, were now monuments to a collective suicide. The survivors from both sides wandered through the ruins in a state of shock. The intricate social and spiritual bonds that had held their world together for 1,000 years were severed. There was no leadership, no ceremony, only the ghosts of what had been. It was in this despair that the final, most profound act of the ancestral Puebloan people took place. Not a battle, but a decision, a pact. They would leave all of it. The great houses, the kivas, the roads, the canyons that had cradled their ancestors, they were no longer homes. They were tombs, reminders of a pride that had led to ruin. The first steps away were the hardest. Families, once part of a thriving metropolis, were now small, shattered bands of refugees. They took only what they could carry, a little food, a few tools, and the heavy weight of their grief. They cast one last tearful glance at the stone cities, burning the memory into their minds before turning their backs on them forever. This was the great pact of silence. They would scatter to the four winds in small, unassuming groups. They would never again build cities that reached for the heavens, lest that pride return. And they would never ever speak the name of Malin or of the war that had consumed them. They would erase the memory, lest it poison their future. This was the great disappearance. Not a vanishing act, but a deliberate, desperate act of cultural self-preservation, a flight from memory itself. This exodus reshaped the Puebloan soul, the new societies that emerged. The ancestors of the modern Hopi, Zuni, and Rio Grande Pueblos were fundamentally different. No more great houses that scraped the sky. Villages were now built to blend with the earth, not dominate it. Power was intentionally diffused, spread across clans and councils to prevent any one person from ever holding absolute authority again. The kiva, once a symbol of a specific clan's power, was reconsecrated as a place of communal unity. The memory of Malin, the unspoken trauma of a leader who demanded absolute authority, was encoded into their new social DNA. The Kachina belief system, with its emphasis on community, balance, and the collective good, became dominant. It was a spiritual immune response to the fanatical ideology that had torn them apart. They had learned the ultimate lesson that the greatest threat to a people can come from within. And now, after this long journey through the ashes of a civil war, we must reveal the final truth. The story we have told you, the story of Malin, the charismatic heretic, the great betrayal, and the epic civil war, is a lie, or rather it is a narrative, a way to make sense of the scattered, confusing, and often contradictory evidence the ancestral Puebloans left behind. There was no single woman named Malin, no single great betrayal. The truth, as is often the case in the lost pages of history, is far more complex and perhaps even more tragic. Malin is the name we give to a confluence of pressures that shattered a civilization. The great drought we dismissed at the beginning, it was real and it was relentless. Dendrochronology, the story told by tree rings, paints a grim picture of a decades-long torment that withered their crops and turned the land to dust and the violence. It was not a single organized civil war, but a series of brutal, desperate conflicts. At sites like San Canyon Pueblo, we see the brutal evidence. Entire villages burned, their inhabitants massacred. This wasn't warfare against an outside invader. The patterns of destruction are intimate, suggesting clan on clan or village on village violence, a horrifying fight for the last remaining resources. The great betrayal was not the act of one woman, but the slow, grinding failure of a society to adapt. The Civil War was a symptom of this failure. Malin is a symbol, a personification of the internal strife, the radical new ideas, and the human ambition that arose during a time of crisis. She represents the terrifying possibility that the Puebloan people, faced with an existential threat from nature, turned on each other instead of uniting. The story of Malin is the story of how a society can be undone by a perfect storm of climate change, resource scarcity, and social division. The pact of silence was real, not to erase a single woman, but to forget the horrifying truth that they had participated in their own downfall. They chose to remember the drought, a clean and simple explanation, rather than the messiness of their own internal conflict. So when we look at the silent ruins of Chaco Canyon, we should not see a simple story of a people who vanished. We should see a cautionary tale, a tale of a brilliant civilization that reached its breaking point, a warning that echoes through the centuries, more relevant today than ever. The legacy of the ancestral Puebloans is not just in their stunning architecture or their beautiful pottery. It is in the resilience of their descendants, the modern Pueblo people, who carry the lessons of that collapse in their traditions of peace and community. They survived not by forgetting the past, but by fundamentally reshaping their society to ensure it would never happen again. The lost pages of history are never truly lost. They are simply waiting for us to find the courage to read them.